Number 10. Grieving husband. In May 2022, a Greek helicopter pilot named Babis Anagnostopoulos was found guilty of murdering his wife, 20-year-old Caroline Crouch, and hanging their pet dog from the banister. 34-year-old Babis tried to make the crime appear like a gang of criminals had broken into the home and it was a robbery gone wrong. After he killed his wife, he tied himself up and called the police. Cops arrived to find Babis tied up, Caroline dead, and their baby daughter on the ground near her mother. Babis played the part of the grieving husband well enough to get away with the crime temporarily. The media went nuts over the story and everyone felt bad for Babis. That is, until police uncovered the truth. He was arrested shortly after Caroline's funeral ended. Police became suspicious of his story when they couldn't find a trace of the gang he claimed he had tied him up, suffocated his wife, and stole over $16,000 in cash and jewelry. They also became suspicious when data collected from a fitness tracker Caroline wore on her wrist showed her heart had stopped beating before the alleged break-in took place. In court, friends of Caroline testified that Babis was a controlling narcissist. The court also heard about the detailed planning that went into the murder. This included memory cards from closed-circuit television cameras being removed and Babis going into the basement of the home to get his motorcycle gloves 4 hours before Caroline was killed, which he wore to create a crime scene. The jig was finally up. Babis admitted to suffocating Caroline as she was asleep because the couple had gotten into an argument when their daughter fell off the couch while Babis was supposed to be watching her. Caroline had stormed off to bed without apologizing to him, and apparently that was enough to make him want to kill her. Babis was sentenced to 27 years in prison. Number 9. REPUBLK Airways Brawl. In 2019, disturbing video footage leaked showing what looked like a pilot spitting at and fighting with a female flight attendant on a jet bridge at Denver International Airport. The pilot, 36-year-old William Thomas, appeared to start the confrontation by spitting on the woman, 29-year-old Marisha Sporer. She slaps him in the face in response, and then the pilot begins punching her in the face and stomach repeatedly. The footage sparked widespread concerns about the employee's conduct. Their employer, a regional airline known as REPUBLK Airways, quickly reassured the public that there were no passengers on the plane at the time and that both the pilot and his coworker were fired immediately after the incident. But the brawl also caught the attention of police, who opened an investigation into the violence, which took place during a layover. It was eventually discovered that the pair had been involved in a romantic relationship, and that Sporer reportedly saw something that upset her on Thomas's phone. The couple broke up, but apparently couldn't truly let go enough to keep things professional. They decided to sort out their mistakes in the worst place imaginable, at work. They were both charged with assault and disturbing the peace and had to answer to the law in addition to losing their jobs. Number 8. Disorderly pilots. Airlines have had strict standards for their pilots. The United States Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, bans pilots from drinking less than 8 hours before flying. None of that mattered to pilot Thomas Cloyd and co-pilot Christopher Hughes, apparently, though. In 2002, the pair went out drinking in Miami one night when they knew they had to catch an early flight to Phoenix the next morning. Employees at the bar where they were drinking said that they finally kicked them out around 5 a.m. They arrived back at their hotel 30 minutes later and caught a shuttle to the airport 4 hours after that. It was reported that Cloyd acted belligerent as soon as he arrived at the airport. When a security guard told him to throw away his coffee, he refused. He finally complied when police were called. Alcohol could be smelt on his breath, but he denied that he had been drinking. The plane had already been pulled to the runway when officers arrived to arrest the disorderly pilots. TSA staff called the aircraft back to the terminal, where breathalyzers revealed that Cloyd's blood alcohol content was .091. Hughes blew a .084. Both were well above the FAA's limit of .04. Their careers were over by then, and investigators soon discovered that Cloyd had 2 prior arrests for alcohol-related offenses that he never revealed to his employer. The case went back and forth between state and federal court before ultimately landing under the jurisdiction of the state of Florida. The pilots tried but failed to get the case thrown out and were sentenced to 5 years and 2.5 years in prison. Number 7. Mid-air meltdown. On a JetBlue flight in 2012, a pilot had a meltdown mid-air. It's horrifying when a passenger on the plane begins acting erratically, but what do you do when it's the pilot? During a trip from New York to Las Vegas, Captain Clayton Osborne allegedly began hitting random buttons and telling air traffic controllers to, quote, quiet down. He started speaking nonsense to First Officer Jason Dowd, saying that they needed to, quote, take a leap of faith, and that, quote, things don't matter, and that, quote, we're not going to Vegas. He then turned the communications radio off, dimmed the equipment monitors, and started rambling on about religion. Co-pilot Dowd used his head and cleverly tricked Osborne into going into the passenger compartment, then locked the cockpit door and changed the code. When Osmond couldn't get back, he told passengers to pray and started running up and down the aisle ranting about Jesus and Al-Qaeda. Thankfully, there were brave passengers on board who tackled him and tied him up with seatbelt extenders. Dowd took over the flight with the help of an off-duty pilot. The plane was diverted and landed safely in Amarillo, Texas. Osmond had worked for JetBlue for 12 years leading up to the incident. He showed up late that day, which was very unusual for him. He was suspended from his job and charged with interference with the flight crew, but was found not guilty by reason of insanity. It was alleged in court documents that a brief psychotic episode was triggered by a lack of sleep. Osmond ended up suing the airlines for not recognizing that he was mentally ill and blamed JetBlue for endangering the lives aboard Flight 191. Would you be brave enough to tackle someone that's acting crazy on a plane? Tell us in the comments, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. Number 6. Shady Flying Career. Christian Kit Martin had a 30-year career as an Army major before he went on to become a private commercial airline pilot. But in late 2019, his lengthy and successful career was cut short when he was arrested in an airport in Kentucky for allegedly murdering 3 of his neighbors. In 2015, Martin was going through a bitter divorce from his ex-wife Joan. Their neighbor, Calvin Phillips, was helping Joan move her things out of the former couple's home they shared when they discovered classified military documents and other incriminating materials. They reported it to police, and that landed Martin in a court-martial hearing. Phillips was supposed to testify as a witness at the hearing, but never got the chance. He was found dead with multiple gunshot wounds along with his wife Pamela and a third neighbor, Edward Dansereau. Martin was discharged from the Army and started a new life as an American Airlines pilot. Meanwhile, the triple murder case went cold. Investigators reopened the case and new evidence came to light. This time, their findings led them to Martin, who will now spend the rest of his life in prison for killing his neighbors in an attempt to cover up his past crimes. Number 5. Flying Frying Pan. 54-year-old Andrew McIntosh was a pilot with the Netherlands and Belgium-based company TUI Airways. In 2018, Andrew and his soon-to-be ex-wife Patricia were trying to sell their home in the English village of Nightcote, but the couple couldn't find anyone to buy it. When Andrew suggested lowering the asking price of the house, Patricia refused. This sent him into a rage. Seeing red, he punched and kicked Patricia, then beat her to death with a frying pan. He then foolishly confessed to the act to a friend in a text message. The friend contacted the authorities, who then arrested Andrew. Andrew admitted to killing Patricia, but denied committing murder based on diminished responsibility. In other words, he argued that mental illness, in this case depression, caused him to act in a way he normally wouldn't act if he were in his right mind. He claimed that he simply, quote, lost control. But the judge didn't buy it. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 17 years. The sentence came as good news to Patricia's family, who expressed their disappointment that Andrew forced them to suffer through a trial instead of pleading guilty. Number 4. Nervous Pilot. When the pilot of TransAsia Airways Flightlet 235 misconstrued an emergency scenario and turned off the wrong engine, the plane crashed into Taipei's Keelung River. A warning alert for one engine sounded 2 minutes after takeoff, signaling a flameout or power failure. As a result, the pilot mistakenly turned off the only functional engine, remaining oblivious about what he had done for another 2 minutes. Despite being able to restore some of the previously functioning engine's power, too much time, altitude, and speed had been lost. The plane's wing collided with a bridge before the aircraft crashed into the river, killing 43 of the 58 passengers aboard, including both pilots and the crew. In the investigation, audio from the flight surfaced. You can hear the pilot saying, "Wow, pulled back the wrong side throttle." The captain's flight history was examined in depth and criticism increased. He had already failed the abnormal start portion, which entailed going over the correct procedure in the event of an engine burnout during takeoff, in earlier practice sessions, flight simulators, and training. Although he passed, his evaluation said that he was prone to get nervous and may make verbal errors during the engine start procedure. Number 3. Just short of the runway. When Asiana Flight 214 crashed while attempting to land at San Francisco International Airport in 2013, 3 persons were killed and 182 were injured. The weather was perfect, and at 11:27 a.m., air traffic control cleared the pilots for a visual approach landing. However, by 11:28, the Boeing 77 had fallen just short of the runway. Within an hour, the plane's autopilot had been accidentally turned off, and the plane began to lose speed and altitude. The tail end of the plane collided with and broke the seawall as it approached too low and too slow. 4 flight attendants were swept out of a hole in the back and critically injured while still strapped into their seats. As the crew jumped into action, the plane began to billow dark smoke and catch fire, and yet the emergency evacuation was just as negligent as the landing. 2 emergency slides were deployed inside, confining and nearly suffocating passengers and crew members. 10 individuals were sent to the hospital in critical condition, and 3 teenage girls died, 2 at the site and 1 later at the hospital. One of the victims, Ye Mengwan, is reported to have survived the crash, only to be run over by a fire truck rushing to the scene. The family of Mengwans filed a claim against the city of San Francisco, but it was eventually dismissed and settled out of court. Number 2. Snoozing. On May 22, 2010, an Air India Express Boeing 737 tried to land at India's Mangalore International Airport. It did so briefly before overshooting the runway by 790 feet or just about 240 meters, breaking up into many pieces, erupting in a fireball, and coming to a halt on the side of a steep hill. Despite the fact that both pilots were experienced and had flown into the respective airport 82 times, the aircraft flew in much too high, eventually touching down about a mile beyond where it should have. As details regarding the hours and minutes leading up to the catastrophe surfaced, the captain was judged to be at blame. According to the cockpit recordings, the pilot Zlatko Gluica can be heard snoring for more than 100 minutes of the flight, right up until the jet begins its descent. Gluica, groggy from his long snooze, noticed too late that they were not descending swiftly enough and were approaching the runway twice as high as they should have been. Despite his first officer's request to abort and go around 3 times, Gluica ignored him. In fact, the later crash assessment indicated that by the time he attempted to pull up, he could have likely saved the aircraft by using maximum manual braking and reverse propulsion, but he didn't do so. There were 158 fatalities and 8 serious injuries. Number 1. Nosedive. A pilot error also caused the second deadliest aviation catastrophe in U.S. history, killing 265 people. On November 12, 2001, an American Airlines Airbus A300 was on a normal trip between New York City and the Dominican Republic when it crashed into the Bell Harbor neighborhood of New York. The plane actually broke apart in the sky shortly after takeoff. The vertical stabilizer and rudder parted first, followed by the engines, and the plane nosedived. Many people couldn't imagine a jet coming apart at such a low altitude, but investigators revealed that the plane's first officer had been violently alternating between rudder pedals. This had put far too much strain on the plane's vertical stabilizer, which then broke off. The pilot was attempting to stabilize the aircraft as it followed in the wake of another flight that took off shortly before 587, an effort that was eventually deemed unnecessary. The larger Boeing 77 was nearly 5 miles or about 8 kilometers ahead of them, and the plane would have steadied even if the pedals were not used. When the plane's vertical stabilizer failed, calamity struck. The plane, no longer stable, dipped forward and into a flat spin, generating enough aerodynamic force to pull the engines from the frame. 5 of the dead were not passengers, but civilians, injured by the wreckage fragments hitting the ground. Thanks for watching. Would you rather be on a plane full of crazy people or a plane full of snakes? Tell us which would be worse in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time on The Bad Badger.